say that we'll do is we'll look how far each of those two goals is, each of those two measures is from its goal, and then we'll ask how long we think it might take to get back to the goal for each of them, and we'll make a judgment because our tools work in one direction. We're either tightening or loosening. So it's a very challenging situation to say we can have that situation right now. That's not what we're trying to do at all. It's also not what the forecast is. I don't know any mainstream forecast that shows significant problems like that.
Well, just to follow up, yesterday, the UCLA Anderson forecast said there's a high probability of a recession. Where do you stand on whether or not the slowdown you're seeing creates a higher probability or concern that you may have on recession? Thank you.
There's always an unconditional possibility of a recession. It might be broadly in the range of 1 in 4 at any time. If you look back through the years, there could be within 12 months a 1 in 4 chance of a recession. So the question is whether whether this current situation, those possibilities are elevated. I will say this. We don't make such a forecast. If you look at outside forecasts, forecasters have generally raised, a number of them have raised their possibility of a recession somewhat, but still at relatively moderate levels, still in the region of the traditional, because they were extremely low. If you go back 2 months, people were saying that the likelihood of a recession was extremely low. So has moved up, but it's not high.
Chris.
Hi, thank you. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. As you know, I guess last night, President Trump fired 2 members of the Federal Trade Commission, an independent agency, and this could cause the kind of legal fight about the administration's power to fire independent people. If those firings stand, is that a threat to the Fed's independence? Could he do the same thing to the Fed board?
Come on.
So what I think I did answer that question in this very room some time ago, and I no desire to change that answer and have nothing new for you on that today.
Well, maybe I'll have another mulligan. As you know, I wanted to go back to the consumer sentiment, particularly the inflation expectations in the University of Michigan survey. In the summer of 2022, you cited the rise in the long-term inflation expectations in that index as the reason that you went big with a 3/4 point hike. So I know you've talked about all the different measures now, but you seem to not be placing the same weight on that. And so I'm just wondering, are you dismissing what we saw last week from the University of Michigan, or does that carry the same weight as it did in the past?
So I mentioned it back then, but in no way did I place a huge weight on it. I think that was a ex post story, but it wasn't the case. That was a preliminary reading, and so is this. And it's also, this is that Michigan, the one you're referring to, the longer term thing. We look at it, we don't dismiss data that we don't like. We force ourselves to look at it, but it is an outlier compared to market-based and compared to other survey-based assessments of longer run inflation expectations. So we got to keep that in mind. And I would just say we look at all of them, and that was kind of an outlier, but nonetheless we take notice of it.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. There's a worry on Wall Street that when you say you want to study the
watching that carefully, and we think it's a good time for us to wait for further clarity before we consider adjusting our policy stance.
Do you think it's going to be hard to get clarity in a government by tweet? I mean, do you have a feeling that at some point you actually will have a forecast you can trust?
Yes, I think we will. It's hard to say when that will be. These decisions are going to be made and they're going to be implemented, and then we'll know. At that point, we'll know what the decisions are, and we'll have to make assessments then about the implications for the economy. Those things will happen. A lot of them will happen over the course of, in coming months, certainly over the course of this year, and we'll be adapting as we go.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. At the beginning, you were talking about separating the signal from the noise and tariff inflation from non-tariff inflation. Can you walk us through what that looked like over the last couple of months, if there were specifics from the January meeting to now that helped you make those distinctions?
So when we say separating the signal from the noise, that's just a way of saying that things are highly uncertain, and that you're reading about developments. The news is full of developments of tariffs being put on and taken off and things like that. Some of that is noise in the sense that it's not really telling you anything. You're trying to extract a signal from that. And the signal is what's going to be the effect on economic activity, on inflation, on employment, and all those things. So that's really when we say signal and noise. Sorry, the second thing was...
or similarly for tariff inflation, non-tariff inflation, ways that you're making the distinction.
That's sort of a special case of that. The idea being, and I do think that the first 2 months of this year are a great example. You've got high readings for goods inflation after a string of readings that average close to zero. And you have to ask, it's coming during tariffs, but you can't, it's very hard to actually scientifically go back and match up those increases and say, yes, I can prove that that's from tariffs, but it kind of has to be to some extent. Plus noise, there can be idiosyncratic readings in various categories, which will shortly reverse, and that happens too, and that could be a big piece of it. I think we'll know in a couple of months. We'll know whether those were, where that really was from. But that's another case where I think it's going to be very, very challenging to unpack the inflation that we see over the course of this year and be able to say with confidence how much of that came from inflation and how much of it, from tariffs and how much of it didn't. But that's what we'll be doing. We'll be doing that, and so will everybody else, and we'll all be trying very hard to make that assessment. And I'm sure we will make a lot of progress on that, and we already have. But it's going to be a challenge.
Do you have a sense yet as to what in your mind would make something cross from noise to a signal, what that threshold would look like?
It would depend on what we're talking about. I mean, obviously, you're looking for direct evidence that particular pieces of inflation are or are clearly not caused by tariffs. For example, if it's something that was, in the service sector that was far away from anything that's tariffed, you might think, okay, well, that is, like, frankly, housing services inflation, which, by the way, has been behaving well, which for some time was kind of our problem. Now it's slow, but it's definitely, moving down in a very good way. It's more now with goods and to some extent with non-housing services inflation.
Thanks for taking our questions, Chair Powell. Kelly O'Grady, CBS News. So consumer sentiment has dipped dramatically, but you say the economy and the hard data is still solid. What is your message to consumers that clearly disagree and don't feel that strength? Because the hard data they're looking at is their grocery bill.
Okay, so a couple things. The grocery bill is about past inflation, really. There was inflation in 21, 2, and 3, and prices went up. The current level, it's not the change in prices. It's they're unhappy, and they're not wrong to be unhappy that prices went up quite a bit, and they're paying a lot for those things. So I think that is the fundamental fact, and has been for a long time, a couple of years, why people are unhappy with the economy. It's not that the economy is not growing. It's not that inflation is really high. It's not that unemployment is high. It's none of those things. We have, 4.1% unemployment. We've got 2% growth, and it's a pretty good economy. But people are unhappy because of the price level, and we completely understand and accept that.
And just to follow up, why are you still projecting 2 rate cuts this year if your own projections show inflation higher for longer? Does that mean you see a slowdown in economic growth as a real threat?
So I think remember we came into this with, at the December meeting, the median was 2 cuts, the median was. And so you come in and you see, broadly speaking, weaker growth, but higher inflation. And they kind of balance each other out. So you think, and unemployment is really only a 1/10 change. So there's just not a big change in the forecast. There really isn't. Modest, meaningfully higher growth and meaningfully higher inflation, which call for different responses, right? So they cancel each other out, and people just said, okay, I'm going to stay here. But the second factor is it's so highly uncertain. Is just, we're sitting here thinking, and we obviously are in touch with businesses and households all over the country. We have an extraordinary network of contacts that come in through the reserve banks and put in the beige book, and also through contacts at the board. And we get all that. And we do understand that sentiment has fallen off pretty sharply, but economic activity has not yet. And so we're watching carefully. So I would tell people, that the economy seems to be healthy. We understand that sentiment is quite negative at this time, and that probably has to do with turmoil at the beginning of an administration that's making big changes in areas of policy, and that's probably part of it. I do think the underlying unhappiness people have about the economy, though, is more about the price level.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask, first of all, if you could clarify, you were talking about how tariffs were a good part of the uptick in the inflation forecast. And I was just wondering.
Organization that was funded by USAID, which is that the attack that Elon made.
Anticipating some of the tariffs that might be coming on April 2nd. And then also, if you wouldn't mind, talking a little more about the balance sheet decision and what drove that. Did that have anything to do with expectations of how the debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling, might affect the reserve supply?
Yeah. So in the SEP, you'll see that there's not further progress on core inflation this year. We're kind of flatlining, going sideways. We don't ask people to write down how much of this is from tariffs and how much of it is not. But some of it is from tariffs. We know that tariffs are coming in. We know that they're probably already, all forecasters have tariff inflation affecting core PCE inflation, core CPI inflation this year, without exception. I'm not aware of an exception. So it's in there. I can't tell you how much of that it is. In terms of the balance sheet, so yeah, I think, I guess the way I'd say it is, it was the flows in and out of the TGA that got us thinking about it. But as we thought about it, we really came to the view that this was a good time to make the move that we made. And
that's quite bullish. That's quite bullish. She's saying it's not only because the TGA
came around to the view that
itself.
we would do the same thing we'd already done, which is I guess in June, was it June, whenever it was, we lowered the pace of QT, and we're just going to do that again. We're going to cut it roughly in half. And the sense of that is, if you're cutting the pace of QT roughly in half, then the runway is probably doubled. Okay, so it's going to be slower for longer, and people really like that. People thought that's a good idea. It's like a plane. You can think of it like a plane coming in for a landing. As we get closer, and we by the way, we still think that reserves are abundant. Although you begin to see some of the things we look at begin to react a little bit, but we still think that they're abundant. And of course, now the TGA is emptying out, so reserves are higher now, so you can't really see the underlying signal. So we came around to the view, and it had a lot of appeal, and so we did it. It has no implications at all for monetary policy. It has no implications at all for the ultimate size of the balance sheet. It isn't sending a signal in any hidden way that you can try to tease out. It's just not there. We're basically, it's very consistent with our plans and our practices that we've published and that we've followed since we began this, what is a very successful, rundown of the balance sheet. Again, the second time that we've slowed the pace, and we've said that we would stop when we were somewhat above the level we judge as ample. And clearly we're not at that level yet, but we're going to be approaching it more slowly. It's a common sense kind of a thing, and it had pretty broad appeal, I will say.
Claire.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. You said in January, Chair Powell, that inflation expectations remained well anchored. Would you still say they remain well anchored today? And just to reiterate the question of Elizabeth, if they're not so well anchored, why hasn't there been a more radical shift to the policy path today? Thank you.
So when we talk about inflation expectations being well anchored, we're talking about longer run inflation expectations. And they really haven't moved much. I mean, if at all. There's one reading that everyone's focusing on that's higher, but the other survey readings and the market-based readings all show relatively, well anchored inflation expectations. You would expect that expectations of inflation over the course of a year would move around because conditions change. And in this case, we have tariffs coming in. We don't know how big, what's big. There's so many things we don't know, but we kind of know there are going to be tariffs, and they tend to bring growth down. They tend to bring inflation up in the first instance. So I would say I'm not dismissing what we're seeing in short-term inflation expectations. We, as I mentioned, follow that very carefully. But when we say expectations are well anchored, we're really looking at, longer terms, 5 year and out. And there's really no story to tell 5 years and out, either in market-based or in surveys. But we'll watch it. I mean, we're not, we're not going to miss any evidence that longer term or medium term inflation expectations are moving.
Neil.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. Treasury Secretary Bessent has observed that a large share of job growth over the last couple of years has been in what he calls government or government adjacent sectors, healthcare, education. Do you agree that there's some weakness in underlying private job growth? And do you see the composition of job growth as something that has policy implications?
So that has been the case. We talked about that over the course of the last year. There were some good number of months and times when a lot of the job creation was concentrated in, educational institutions, healthcare, state governments, things like that. There were also times when private sector job growth has been moving in a healthy range. I mean, they're all jobs, but and remember,
Nick
we're
just sent me this. Maybe this is why crypto is running, because President Trump is reportedly expected to make a major update to his upcoming crypto strategy. What do you think that could be? Nick, what are you speculating here, sir?
I've got no idea. I just got this on my Discord. I've got no idea what it could possibly be. But
the whale
I'm not.
You know what
I'm
I
not
think
expecting
it
it to be anything crazy.
You know what I think it is? I think he's going to make an announcement that he's putting Barron in charge of Twitter, not Eric. I think that's the big crypto announcement. Barron's going to start running the Twitter, not Eric. I mean, no jokes.
Maybe we'll get good signals.
I've heard this a few times today, by the way. It's come on the newsroom a few times today. If you look here, let me show you. It's actually come out of here. Here we go. So this is. I mean, I've muted Powell for now because I think he's been getting a bit boring now. So if you look at the newsroom here, it's come out a few times over here. It came out. Hold on, I saw it on the way to. Here we go. Came out here. 18 minutes ago, it came out from Chris, from one of the researchers. And I think it came out way earlier also. So maybe that's why the market's actually moving. As it relates to Bitcoin, 85,800. Dylan, what any views, sir?
So, yeah, I mean, what we do know about this whale, he's the same whale that was longing and shorting when Trump was announcing the strategic reserve.
Ah, you're right. You're right.
An hour ago, okay, or whatever. But now he's flipped long. So yeah, maybe he knows something's coming.
Oh wow. Okay, I didn't actually make that.
That's the same guy.
But wasn't Zach saying that this guy is just a criminal who's playing with laundered money? Well, not laundered money. Sorry, he's trying to launder money.
Well, the guy knows something. He knew who randomly longs 200 or 300 million on a Saturday afternoon, like on the bog or whatever he was doing. You know what I mean? Like, who does that? So,
and then again, before this comes out,
you reckon he was on the bog, Dylan?
I don't know. It's a Saturday. I don't know. Maybe he was on the couch. Who knows?
I don't know if he was on the bog, bro.
Could have been.
It's a good point.
Let's see if
But he wants us to know, right?
Yes, I think
it's all public. He wants us to know.
And sorry, standing here today, would you?
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think we're getting into that point in the press conference where nothing's going to change. Yeah, so again, just going back to it, I'm not sure he was on the bog, but I mean, he did open a very big long.
Matt with CNN. Thank you, Chair Powell. The Fed statement released today removed the line that previously said the committee judges that the risks to achieving its employment and inflation goals are roughly in balance. Can you explain the decision to remove that line? Does it mean that you're now more concerned about inflation or about employment?
Actually, it does not mean either of those things. Sometimes with language, it lives its useful life, and then we take it off, and that was the case here. There's really not meant to be any signal here. Over the past year, conveying the sense of the balance of risks was important, that they be in balance or close to being in balance. That was useful as we approached liftoff, if you remember. But we're past that. I'm sorry, no, beginning to cut.
Hey, don't forget to like or subscribe. The description has links below.
thing.
Fino
now
have the
about
All
this,
Day
and this is
WITIT
like-
album
at
out
pages
now.
like 10, 11, 12
Love.
of the SEP. If you look,